listeners. Welcome to Grief Out Loud. Remember the last time you tried to talk about grief and suddenly everybody left the room? Grief Out Loud is opening up this often avoided conversation because grief is hard enough without having to go through it alone. We bring you a mix of personal stories, tips for supporting children, teens, and yourself, and interviews with professionals in the grief world. Platitude and cliche-free, we promise. Grief Out Loud is hosted by me, Jana Cristofero, and produced by Dougy Center, the National Grief Center for Children and Families in Portland, Oregon. Hey listeners, it's been a bit, so thanks for being patient. I'm still working my way through a backlog of interviews I did in the early spring. This interview with Camille Sapara Barton was one of them. So in our conversation, you'll hear us talking about a particular grief practice they'd like to use during the transition to spring. And since it's now July here in the Northern Hemisphere, you might consider ways to use that practice to mark the transition from and to any season. Camille Sapara Barton is a social imaginer, and part of that work is reimagining how we define and relate to grief. As a writer, artist, and somatic practitioner, Camille wants to create a new grief narrative, one that's expansive enough to include multiple forms of individual and collective grief, for death and non-death losses, and especially for those disproportionately held by queer, trans, and communities of color. We talk about their new book, Tending Grief, Embodied Rituals for Holding Our Sorrow and Growing Cultures of Care and Community, and about Camille's experiences with grief, loss, and being held in community that led them to this work. Camille, thank you for being on Grief Out Loud and making the transatlantic time zone situation work. It's always tricky when we're recording from different continents.
Well, I'm just glad to be here with you and having this conversation. Yeah, thanks for having me.
And I'm really looking forward to delving more into your work, specifically your book, Tending to Grief, Embodied Rituals for Holding Our Sorrow and Growing Cultures of Care in Community. And with everyone who comes on the show, I really like to start the conversation from the personal. And so I wondered how do you want to introduce yourself, locate yourself? What feels important for listeners to know about you?
What feels important in this moment is that I am very much of the African diaspora. I have Nigerian Yoruba heritage, Guyanese heritage, and Celtic on my dad's side. So I'm very, very mixed, but also very rooted in the African diaspora. I grew up in London. I really love music and dancing and plants. But in terms of day-to-day work, I'm a writer, I'm an artist, and embodiment practitioner. And I'm very interested in doing my best to support the growth of networks of care and livable futures. So in some ways, I feel like I think of myself as a social imagineer, someone who's thinking and dreaming of different ways for society and for relationships to look and to figure out small steps to move in that direction for more beautiful futures. One other thing I could say is that when it comes to grief work, I don't necessarily feel like an expert. I feel like someone who's very much in practice with my own grief tending, and I've made some resources that are supporting some people, and I'm really curious to hear more about what works and what doesn't, and just continue being in practice.
There's always a big sigh of relief for me when someone says I'm not an expert in grief. I'm just here trying to figure it out as I go through it and what I hear from other people, because I feel the same way 22 years into this work and in this field. And every time I get introduced somewhere and like, oh, an expert, I'm like, no expert, just a reflector of what hundreds of people have shared with me about their grief, and that we build this knowledge together. So thank you for starting off that way. And in that, since the professional is often personal, what is your personal connection to grief and to this work?
I came to this work out of necessity, out of my own need to, address this full body immersive experience of being submerged into grief for the first time in 2017. I had an abortion that year. And I felt very aligned with it as a decision. Like I'd really felt into it and thought about it, and it was the right decision for me. So I was quite shocked at how much grief came up, at how kind of underwater I felt. If it felt like my body was heavy, I was exhausted, colors seemed less bright, just my whole perception of life was radically altered and kind of stayed that way for quite a few years, if I'm honest. I feel like I'm just kind of emerging from that period in many ways. So I needed to figure out how to be with what was happening. And I tried to find resources, find rituals, tools or practices or spaces to connect with people. And I just couldn't really find anything, um, which was disappointing and made me feel quite angry actually at the lack of space to be with grief and the realization that, oh, wow, if I'm having this experience, there are so many other people, not just in relation to abortion, but all the other kinds of grief. And I sort of, yeah, felt compelled to just try and experiment and figure out a way to support myself and be a companion through my own experience instead of what I felt society was kind of overtly or subtly telling me, you just need to deal with this on your own in a corner and be quiet about it. That felt very much like the messaging. And I decided that I was going to invest the time to experiment and create my own rituals, my own practices, and own pathways to try and navigate grief and allow it to be something that I could grow around and allow myself to transform through and hopefully feel more myself, more authentic rather than shrunk or reduced or fractured from the experience. Yeah, it's been a really interesting 6 or 7 years since that initial entry point, and many other things happened, almost like a domino effect, with grief. So as I was experimenting with different practices, and some of the things I looked into as well were things like touch-based massage and trying to almost do some womb healing. Whilst I was doing that, I had flashbacks and memories come back of sexual abuse, and more the puzzle pieces kept on coming together over the years. And yeah, just kind of had to re-story my childhood. There were lots of clues all along, if I'm honest, and health issues I had that I think are quite common when you experience that for a long time as a child. But I just didn't remember a lot of my childhood. So there were question marks, but yeah, it all just kind of came flooding back. And suddenly I needed to then deal with that as well. And the lack of safety I felt in my body. And as I was recovering and tending to that, I also lost my apartment in a house fire. And there was just like lots of stuff that happened over 6 or 7 years. So it's felt like a kind of deep dive, immersive experience in some ways, but I'm kind of grateful for it at the same time because I feel more myself, more clear, less confused, a lot more compassionate to myself as well. And I think I've done my best with what I had available to me at the time. So yeah, I'm grateful for it now, but it was a hard slog, if I'm honest, especially because there's very little space to be with this kind of stuff in community. And I really hope that changes. I hope the book can support with changing that.
Yeah, as you were talking, I was thinking about how, at least in my realm, I know I have a very skewed sample, but if like you have a parent die or a sibling die, there's at least some general recognition that one, that is a loss, and two, support might be helpful and that grief is
Mm,
valid. Granted, the grief might only be considered valid for like 3 to 6 months, and then now it's time to get over it. But this idea of these other losses, like having an abortion or having an apartment fire or all the thousands of other losses that people experience, there's that added layer of disconnection, of like not even hearing that or labeled as, well, label's a weird word, but like acknowledged as this is a legitimate grief experience. Here are some resources. And yeah, so I was just sitting with like how many steps back from the hard won place of grief acknowledgement that we've gotten to for certain types of losses.
yeah, yeah, I really feel that. And even for folks who do fit into the neat box of bereavement grief, it's still so, it still doesn't feel sufficient. It doesn't take into account people who've grown up with grandparents or who have grown up with cousins and have this deep relationships. If you want time off from work in many European countries, you only get a certain amount of time if it's your spouse or if it's your parent, but they don't acknowledge a lot of the other relationships we can have and deeply grieve when someone dies or a close friend. It still feels very, very limited, even when people do fit into that kind of traditional grief box of like, okay, well, you're allowed to have some feelings about this. So I really feel there's a need to kind of overhaul a lot of it, and just create a lot more permission and space for people to, yeah, to feel emotions that don't allow you to be productive.
You've talked and written about grief as being a generative process, and that really caught my ear because I sometimes hear people talk about grief as being transformative or, well, mostly transformative is the word that comes. And sometimes that can feel, to me, I don't think people mean it this way, but it can almost feel a little dismissive of like, oh, well, this really hard thing happened, but don't worry, you're going to be transformed and somehow you'll be better at the other end of this, which many people will look back and be like, oh, I really have changed and I am proud of all the things I've done. But it often feels a little prescriptive in that way. And I appreciated the word generative, at least for what it meant to me. If it's like it's an energy that creates something. And I just wondered, I mean,
Hmm.
that's just my interpretation, but I wondered if you could talk more about what do you mean by grief as being generative?
Hmm. Thank you for this question. I'm gonna hop from the point of departure you've given around it contributing to something like it. I think for me, it's around it being a kind of life-giving force. It's not useless. And I think that's the association in the Western context that it's inconvenient or it's a waste of time because then we're being lazy and we're not being productive. But I think it's actually a force that creates. And maybe that's what people mean with transforming. And sometimes in that creation, we might have a whole host of other responses in our bodies, or it might affect how we work, how we relate to people. And we might initially think, oh, well, this isn't very helpful. But it's making big shifts. Um, and I tend to have the bias that those shifts end up being supportive to the web of life as well as our own kind of individual existence. But this kind of notion of grief as generative, I have to point to the point of origin for this. And so much of my ways of thinking about grief have been informed by Malidoma and Sobonfu Somé, who are Dagara elders. The Dagara people are indigenous to many parts of West Africa. But Malidoma and Sobonfu grew up in what we now call Burkina Faso. And this is a kind of core tenet within the Dagara worldview that grief is a generative force, that it's something that actually supports the well-being of the community, that allows people to connect to ancestral wisdom, to be in relationship to their lineage and where they come from, but ultimately something that supports the web of life and our place in the world, our place in existing amongst each other and with human and non-human beings. Um, and so, because of this principle in the Dagara context, every month there's a communal grief tending ritual, and everyone is expected to show up and be with their grief because, kind of in contradiction to how it is in the West, the Dagara people believe that unprocessed or untended grief will actually become violence or harm in the community. And so they see it as everyone's responsibility to be in regular conversation, regular tending of one's grief to support the kind of well-being and not bring on harm and difficulty in the collective. Yeah, it really stems from that. And I personally notice the need for myself, especially in these times, to be tending to my grief on a monthly basis. And I'm kind of in practice with that. And I do feel a lot more space. I do feel a lot more clarity about the kind of relationships I'm trying to create or sustain. And there's just an intentionality that can really come through for me after being in that kind of grief tending moment, as well as just having deeper connection to what's going on within me and how, whether I'm in alignment or not. And I'm very interested to kind of see what comes from communities experimenting together, kind of outside of the Dagara context, and what that would bring, what generative could mean in different contexts. But yeah, those are just some of the pieces that I wanted to name around that.
I really appreciate this idea that what you mentioned, the Dagara culture of coming together, that tending to your grief is not only something you need to do for yourself, but it's a responsibility for the well-being of the whole community. And I was like, what an
Mm,
opposite experience of what a lot of people in other societies experience around their grief. And I was just having this image of like, we have to do our recycling or it piles up, right? And then
mm,
you've got like piles of cardboard, and now it's a fire danger and it could potentially become something harmful. But it's a responsibility to come together to tend to your own grief in the witnessing of other people for the health and well being of your whole community. And I was like, oh, that really shifts things in terms of the time it takes and the energy and intention that
mm.
goes into it.
Yeah, truly. I mean, in their beautiful books and interviews, which I highly recommend to anyone who's interested that's listening, they talk a lot about this idea of ancestral dirty laundry. And that really resonates for me looking at the West and, this moment we're in. It's like, wow, we have a lot of ancestral dirty laundry, just things that have been like this recycling image just piled up generationally. I do feel that grief tending is a part of that work to kind of give us space to move somewhere else, like beyond these dynamics that are really not serving any of us. I don't think it's the only thing, but I do think it's part of what needs to shift, just making space to really acknowledge what's happened and its impact on us, how it continues to impact us.
I was just laughing to myself because I think about things like dishes and laundry. They're tasks that are never done. It's not like you do all the laundry and then you never do laundry again. And people sometimes think, oh, if I just do all my grief, there's no more grief. Like I did it all. But
Hmm.
I love that idea. Like, no, the laundry just keeps coming. There's always more to
Yeah.
wash and sort and fold and put away and all of that. We may have started to talk about this, but I was thinking about the idea of collective grief. And I feel like that's a term that really kind of came into at least my awareness with the pandemic for a variety of reasons of things that were
Mm,
impacting large amounts of people. What's your understanding of collective grief and how it kind of relates to this work that you're doing?
mm. I see collective grief as any kind of pain or loss or discomfort that's held communally by a group of people. It can be people who share a certain identity or ethnic group or worldview. So I think of examples being, colonization, people who have been colonized or who are being colonized in this moment. Think of what's happening in Palestine, in Sudan, in Congo. I think there's a lot of grief there for people not only in those locations, but descendants or who share heritage of what it means to have your way of living, your practices, your language taken away from you, and maybe never being able to recover that. And having colonization on most of my lineage, well, pretty much all of my lineages, because many of us in this day and age, have been colonized. It's just a timeline thing, like how recent it's been or not. But for my ancestors who've been more recently colonized on the Yoruba Nigerian side and my Guyanese side, yeah, those ripples are very palpable in the present day. There hasn't really been a recovery because it hasn't fully been acknowledged to have even been a wound, let alone something that we could recover from when there's so much discrimination and harm that continues to flow because of those dynamics. But I also think of the grief that many queer and trans people are experiencing in this moment of having policies put in place that really take away their dignity, their ability to be safe. Um, and that being something that's not just happening in the US, but also anti-gay bills being passed in many parts of the African continent right now, often pushed by US evangelical organizations. I think of the grief of the war on drugs the grief of mass incarceration, ableism, and the stuff that, day to day disabled folks are still having to navigate because of the world not having things in place to support them to live with ease and dignity and safety and belonging. So there's a lot. I mean, I could go on. There is a lot that I feel that, yeah, we sweep under the rug or we intellectualize and we like to, write lots of theory in the West, but I don't know how much space is really made to feel the emotional weight of these pieces and so many that different people are carrying in their own ways. Yeah, I mean, you mentioned COVID and that's a very, very big one. I mean, so many people have ongoing health issues. So many people died during that time. And we've really seen the way that most governments have put profit and business above the needs of everyday people. And there hasn't really been any kind of state level acknowledgement or moment of mourning or acknowledgement of, what we all just went through. You know, it was really intense. I'm still figuring out all the ways it's impacted me. All the ways I can see. There's probably a lot I can't see. So, yeah, I think there is a lot of collective grief, but because of how individualized our societies are, we often end up taking on personal responsibility for this stuff and thinking, oh, well, I have these mental health issues, or this is my personal stuff, as opposed to as a collective, as a group, we have been through this really hard thing. And we have lots of feelings around it that haven't been addressed, and we don't have support to move through it or to move towards whatever healing might look like, or even discuss or feel into what that could be. Yeah, so that's what collective grief means for me.
And so in our conversation, we've talked about some of the individual losses that are also those losses happen in a context. And we've talked about sort of the generational losses and now this idea of collective loss, collective grief. And I'm curious, and you touched on this a bit, but like, how do you see people on the individual level and then also on the larger level coping with grief and loss with numbness or numbing out in ways? And what's your sense of the cost of that?
Mm. I feel like I want to start with the cost part. I think I sense that we are, as a collective, many of us in the West are really unable to access a wide range of emotions. I think the lack of space for grief also constricts how much pleasure and joy we can actually feel because all of the emotions and sensations are connected. So if we're numbing and suppressing things that are uncomfortable to us, we lose the capacity to be with big sensation. It just becomes overwhelming. And then we move towards numbing. So for me, it feels like a loss because there's so many emotions and sensations we're not able to even hold or have the capacity for because of this suppressing of anything that's too much, too big. We don't really know how to hold it. And so I think that we can numb in so many ways today. There's just so many ways under the sun. Some that come up are alcohol. I mean, alcohol is, many people don't consider it a drug, but is a drug, definitely is a drug. And it's so celebrated and accessible in part because it really numbs. It stops us from feeling things so intensely. And many people also use other forms of drugs, understandably, to just try and create some space from the many weights and responsibilities and pains they might be feeling, or to just try and connect to some joy and experience a peak experience moment. So there's a lot of that. I think people might go clubbing, and take substances or not, but just try and experience some kind of joy, some kind of sensory experience that again takes you away from the 9 to 5 or whatever, school, whatever you're kind of being forced to do. So I definitely use clubs and raves in that way for many years as a teenager. Some people numb through shopping, some people numb through social media, some people maybe numbing through sex. I think there's lots of ways that people are trying to, I guess, bypass might be the other word I would use as well, interchangeably with numbing, to kind of move away from feelings that they don't want to feel or they don't know how to feel because they can't hold it. It's too much, it's too overwhelming. And I think that the pressures we're under to try and meet our survival needs, especially in this moment when late stage capitalism is just so vicious. So vicious. There's a lot of pressure people are under. So I do want to emphasize that I don't say this with judgment, like it's bad or people shouldn't be doing this. I think most people are just trying their best. But because we don't have very much space and there's so much pressure to make enough money to survive and look after people in our lives that, when the weekend comes, people just want to have a good time and have a tiny bit of respite. There are some definite ways to do that that I've named, and people don't necessarily have a lot of time to or desire to get into the messier, stickier feelings, especially when there's not very many supports and not very many roadmaps about how one could do that.
I was surprised a little as I was listening to you talk about kind of the ways that people numb out or maybe the like motivation behind some of those behaviors. And sometimes I can think it gets perceived as like just trying not to feel anything. But a lot of what you were saying is like it's an attempt to change the channel to a different emotion, to have a respite from maybe the like cacophony of a certain type of emotion or experience people are having in their day-to-day life and wanting to pursue something else. But then I was going back to
Mm,
what you said at the beginning, that if we're always trying to turn the channel away from maybe the harder emotions, the ones we don't really want to spend time in, which are often the ones associated with grief, it makes it harder to tune into the other channels too. They all get a
hmm
little crackly. So in that, I was curious, in the work that you are doing personally, but also the work you're putting forth in your book, Tending Grief, what's the narrative you're wanting to create? Because I know you're like a big
mm.
picture person, social imaginer, which I love. That I was like, can I get that job? That sounds like a good job, but a really hard job. So what narrative is kind of the core of all of that? And so in this work, what's the narrative you're wanting to create around grief?
Mm. The narrative that I want to create around this is that grief is not limited to bereavement alone or the death of a loved one. Grief, I think, is ultimately a range of emotions and sensations that we can feel in our body and that affect the way we perceive life and move through life. And it can really relate to a whole host of things, collective things, as well as just the grief of versions of ourselves no longer existing, the grief of ecocide. There are so many different things to grieve. And so moving away from this idea that it's just about the death of a being, but also there's a beauty and intimacy and a power in being with grief in community because it can really help to reduce isolation, build trust, and ultimately help us get clear on what we really care about and start strategizing about how we can move towards that with others. Because I think part of the isolation that we feel is coming from this idea that, no one else is going through it, that we have to deal with it on our own, that we shouldn't give ourselves permission to feel it. So part of the narrative I want to seed is that there's actually a power and an agency that we have when we come together and give ourselves permission to grieve. And there is a generative force that can come from that, where we can maybe, reflect with others and notice, if you're struggling with this and I'm struggling with this, does it need to be this way? Maybe it could be something else. Maybe we could actually change these conditions and the harm that's happening wouldn't have to happen. Maybe we could live in a different way. So I think there are so many benefits from actually moving into those feelings that at first might seem really scary and really hard and, oh, we don't want to touch that. But there's gold there because it actually gives us an indication of what's not working for us, as well as what we love, what we want more of. And we start to have the space to maybe consider other things are possible.
And I know that the embodied practices and rituals are a really big part of how you personally came to that more clarifying experience in grief. Do you remember, like, maybe the first time or the second or the third, like one of your early times of being like, oh, here's a new discovery. Like, here's a ritual or an embodied practice and what that meant for you.
Yeah, there's a couple I'm going to name. The first official grief ritual I went to was led by Sobonfu Somé while she was still alive and living in California. It was at Spirit Rock, this lovely meditation center in the Bay Area, and she was doing a day-long grief ritual. I hadn't been living in the Bay very long. I was missing a lot of my friends and dealing with, I guess, some grief of my life changing and not really knowing how to orient myself to this new place. This ritual was really rooted in the Dagara cosmology. So it had different altar spaces and there was drumming throughout. It was very physical and embodied, and a lot of cathartic release was happening. And I felt so at home. Felt so happy to like have this space and not have to pretend to be okay and to just be in that kind of communal experience of people just letting themselves fall apart, but in being held while they could fall apart. So that was a really powerful entry point of like, okay, this is a thing that can happen and this is really healing. But in hindsight, looking back on my earlier years as a teenager, experiencing a lot of depression and mental health challenges, dance rituals were really, I guess, the way I coped with grief then. Going to clubs or going to raves, I really started to experiment with ways to use dance to move the discomfort I was feeling through my body, to kind of be in conversation with it. It really, I guess, was a core part of my sort of journey into embodied work and practice, and sort of starting to track sensations and understand what they meant, and really noticing the difference from entering a dance space, early in the night towards leaving and just feeling such a sense of lightness and clarity and connection to where I was. At the time, I didn't think of those as grief processing rituals, but looking back, I think that, yeah, in many ways that's what they were. And I now continue to experiment with that outside of clubs, sometimes in the club, but with Dance Your Grief, which is a practice in the book. And yeah, I think it just kind of continues in this tradition of rituals in much of the African diaspora where dance is used either to connect to spirit, ancestral wisdom, or to move grief, to honor change. So there's lots of traditions in the diaspora that very much root dance. It's kind of a healing technology. So I just see it as part of that continuation, and I'm very grateful for, yeah, for having had dance in my life. I don't know if I would be here if I hadn't had that at that time.
And I really love that, when sometimes when you hear the term like embodied practice or ritual, we think like, ooh, super formal. Like we're going to have to get a lot of training and we're going to have a lot of accoutrements to go with it. And to think like just dancing can definitely be one of those ways that we are embodying the emotional energy that we are experiencing. And like you said, moving it in some way or shifting it in some way. And, here in the Northern Hemisphere where I live, we're heading into spring. Is there a ritual or practice or from your book or from your experience that you turn to during this time of the year?
Oh, so many things come to mind. A really tried and tested ritual that I use pretty continuously is the grief jar practice. So it's quite simple. You can just get any old jar and put it somewhere that you see every day. I have it on my altar. You can cut up some small bits of paper and have that next to it. Whenever there's a moment of grief or something around loss or discomfort, I usually write it on the piece of paper and put it in the jar. And on the full moon or any time that feels good to you, you can take time to have a little ritual, with intention to kind of be with all of the things that have accumulated over the month and, shed tears if they want to calm, make noises, speak what needs to be spoken. And I like to end up submerging each piece of paper in a bowl of water. Other folks might like to burn it, with safe provisions if you're going to work with fire. Um, and I really love that as a practice. I think as a spring kind of slant on that, if it's interesting, people might want to maybe make a grief jar based on some of the harder things that happen over winter, or the things that you might want to shed, or at least to shift a bit, so that you can really welcome in the gifts of spring and the things that you want to blossom and put energy into in these months where there is more sun, where there is more energy, where everything's opening. But because there is a lot of grief and we had a very hard winter collectively on Earth, there's probably a lot there for people that might be getting in the way of really feeling that spring energy or allowing that opening. So that could be one to experiment with, is to make a grief jar, but specifically around winter, the things that happened, and spend some time maybe being with that grief, and hopefully connecting a bit more to the spring energy. And not that it's going to completely disappear, but maybe the tone, the flavor, the texture of it might change somewhat and allow for there to be more of a dialogue with what is opening and growing and what's also composting and shedding.
Thank you for sharing that really concrete suggestion for listeners to maybe find a way to regularly do some of this grief shifting. And that's one of the things I really appreciate about the title of your book, Tending Grief, because it's not like transforming grief or clearing grief or getting rid of grief. It's like tending to it. And when I think about things I tend to, I have to continually tend to them. Like it's a ongoing practice, again, like the laundry that we mentioned earlier in our conversation. So thank you for having this conversation with me and for being part of Grief Out Loud and for your book and for what the work and the offering, the invitation that you're putting out to the world to be more intentional and engaged with grief, whether it's from a death loss or a non-death loss or from the host of things that happen every day that can spark some emotion of loss and grief. So yeah, thank you. That's a long way of saying thank you for being part of this.
Thank you for having me. It's been great being in conversation with you.
And listeners, I will put lots of links to Camille's work, their website, and also all the places you can find the book Tending Grief. So please, please, please go check that out. And as always, I offer gratitude to you for being part of our listening community, for tuning in, for sharing the show with people who you think might be helped or interested at least in what we're talking about here. If you want to reach out to me, you can always email me at griefoutloud@dougy.org. That's DOUGY.org. It's also our main website where you can find information about our local programming, all of our free downloadable resources, and each and every episode of Grief Out Loud. Excited as always to share that the podcast is sponsored in part by the Chester Stephan Endowment Fund. Thanks again for listening. We hope you'll join us again next time.